And so, hello everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us today for our Safety Updates webinar series. My name is Lizbeth and I'm the Assistant Director for the Southern California NIOSH Education and Research Center. Our mission is to contribute to the safety, health, and wellness of the workforce in Region 9 and across the nation. This webinar series was designed with our mission in mind, with the overall goal of bringing awareness to new and relevant workplace hazards and practices. So today we actually have a webinar jam-packed with information, especially because we do have a new standard on the books. So I don't want to take too much time going over some of the logistics. This webinar is being recording and the recording will be available on our website later today. If you do have any questions throughout the webinar, please use the chat or the Q&A feature to ask to submit your questions, and we'll go ahead and answer those throughout the webinar. We do have an evaluation, and we do highly encourage you all to complete the evaluation, especially those who are seeking continuing education contact hours, because we did need your evaluations to be able to become reaccredited for us to continue to be able to offer these hours to you all. So you will receive an evaluation after today's webinar. Please submit your requests for continuing education through the evaluation form. We do have a couple of questions included there for that. And we'll go ahead and send out your certificates within 1 to 2 business days via email. So with that, I do want to hand it over to Alba to introduce herself and get us started with the webinar.
Hello, everyone. Liz, thank you so much. You are awesome. I love what UCLA and UCI through NIOSH are doing and how you reach out. We encourage you to also ask about courses that can be taken to your locations. We can go over there and prepare classes for you, and we can do it in both languages, English or Spanish. For those of you that are here that have been following the series, thank you for your time. You guys are the best. Thank you for spreading the message, for making sure you forward this to other people that may benefit from the content. It's all about safety and compliance. I added a little note there because in every single one of these webinars or webinar series, I may mention products, services, tools, etc. And I want you to know that doesn't mean I have tested that specific product, or neither UCLA, the Southern Education Research Center, NIOSH, or Compliance Solutions is endorsing any of these products or services. You can use them, and it's at your own risk. That's what I want you to know and get from this, because today I've gotten so many questions about instrumentation that I wanted to show some of the things that are simple, because we want to start simple, and I just don't want you to think that that's what I want you to use and that's it. All right, so my information is on the screen. You can write that down and look me up as well. I've been doing consulting since 2011. And like I said, because I'm an outreach trainer, I can bring the 10-hour and 30-hour classes as well to your locations. Today, it's all about heat indoor. Goodness gracious, we don't get tired talking about heat illness. It's either outdoor or indoor, and there's still an emphasis program here in California. So a lot of efforts get put into making sure people do not go to the hospital or die because of heat illness. So today, my 3 objectives that I want to fulfill once you're out the door and done with this class is, number 1, what are the key elements? What are these things that, you know, are a little bit headachy and that we need to tackle right now about indoor heat illness? Then I want to describe how accurately measure indoor heat to prevent heat illness. So there's a very simple way. We're going to start there because even Cal/OSHA's FAQ does not get into any complicated measurements or anything of that sort. And number 3, creating an effective and comprehensive supervisor training. So supervisors are always held to a higher standard. And whenever you have me going out there at your facilities, you will see that I talk about this very openly and tell them, you know, you can be held personally liable. There's an actual law here in California, corporate criminal law, that says, you know, either you have to set the example and you cannot go and be the one that gets hurt because your workers are looking up to you. So supervisors are also under a more stringent requirement for training. So we have more layers of training for them, just like we did in outdoor heat illness. But here we have them to be trained on how to take measurements, how to record measurements, and how to really peg those environmental risk factors that are out there in your facilities. Okay, so Is this a brand new standard? Yes, it is, but we really did have it coming. It's not something new. Many of you are very familiar now because you've been doing heat indoor prevention for a long time now. And now it's just about putting all of those things into your written policy. So a little bit of statistics here. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics came out with these numbers from 2011 to 2022, an average of 40 fatalities per year in our nation because of heat. So it is by far, heat is by far the greatest killer when we talk about weather deaths on the job. Heat kills. And 33,890 estimated work-related heat injuries with time away from work, you guys. So this is costing our businesses serious money. And so it makes sense to protect workers. Yes, it's stringent, it's strict, but at the end of the day, we're going to save money. There's been drafts about this standard since 2017. It was kind of put on hold because of COVID pandemic. But if you kept following up with our webinar series, or if you were my client since back then in 2016, 2017, we still had a policy for indoor heat because it's a hazard. It's a recognizable hazard. And under the IIPP, you knew you had to put something in place to help them out. So all of my clients either had coolers every time summer came around, and they had cool down areas and even towels to put around employees next. And they started, doing things for them. Some of you have swamp coolers already in your facility. So you did a lot of the homework and a lot of the things that you needed to protect your workers since before if you were my client. So this is an easy transition. So the Office of Administrative Law finally said, you know what, we like the standard, it's approved. So July 23rd, everybody's like, are you kidding me? We have no time to put this in place, and now it's enforceable. Well, if you really look at what I have here on this slide, we had seen this coming. So something should have been put in place, and now you should just transition it to writing it in your policy. So Palm Springs hit record temperatures last July 6th, 124 degrees. So I think with this new record-breaking, my English today is acting up since very early, okay? So I warn you, if you don't understand something I say, please do put it in the chat. Say, what did she just say? Okay, so breaking temperatures, record-breaking temperatures, 124 degrees in Palm Springs. So of course it's gonna get very hot in those kitchens, warehouses, sheds, welding areas, warehouses, etc. That's what this is all about. We do have Cal OSHA's heat illness prevention guidance resources, and they have an FAQ, and they have an awesome model program that I do want you to use. So does this apply to you? Here we go. Let's just start nitty gritty. The trigger temperature for outdoor is 80 degrees and above. For indoor, 82 degrees and above if employees are present. So for those areas of work where it's hot, but no one goes in there, there's no reason for you to freak out. Just no one goes in there. And I'll talk about a lot of those exemptions for sheds and areas like that. But 82 degrees and above, and your employees are present, which is most of your welding areas when you don't have air conditioning in your facilities, manufacturing plants, warehousing, kitchens, or any other areas that you know for sure is going to hit 82 and above. So what are you required to do? Well, you're required to make sure they have water that is available to them, because there's a word in the regulation that says encourage them to drink water. So when you encourage them to drink water, you give them or put the water nearby so that they can often have that consumption of water, at least 1 quart per hour per worker. And that's very interesting because many times we don't put it close enough, or it's not cool enough, right? And they will not want to drink it. You're supposed to also have cool down areas for people to take breaks and preventative cool down rests. And I know this is a term that everybody's like, what is the preventative cool down rest? That means I don't have any symptoms, but it is hot, it's 82 and above, and I just want to go sit in this air-conditioned room. I can do that. And you will not retaliate against employees that can do that. And you should communicate this right to them during training. And you have to also drill it into supervisors' training sessions so that they know that this is allowed. At the end of the day, we will have a much more productive workforce if they are rested and if they don't have symptoms. And you will be happy to, because no one will go to the hospital, and you will not have any of those scary moments when people are vomiting in the bathroom and then you don't know, oh my goodness, this is heat illness, it's probably heat. Because mind you, if it's hot, if it's 82 degrees and above in your warehouse and you have an employee vomiting in the bathroom, blame it on heat illness. Just if it's hot and they don't feel good, blame it on heat illness until you know otherwise. And you have to do those emergency response procedures depending on the symptoms. So all of that into training, right? So water, cool down areas, preventative cool down rest, emergency response and training. That's what you're required to do, right? And trigger temperature, very clear, 82 and above if your employees are present. Now, the supervisor training is more stringent, and that's something that I was telling you guys. And I'm going to pause for a second just because I see a question here. It is 87 degrees. Please, sir. I will go through clarifying this, Angel. This is a very good question. So 82 degrees and above, that's the trigger temperature. No matter what, you have to have those things in place. Perfect. Now, when we talk about, does this really apply to me? We get into more trigger temperatures because sometimes you have workers who wear PPE that restricts heat removal. Your welders are a perfect example of it. So you don't have to be in foundry type of industry to say, oh yeah, you know, they wear this heat resistant clothing that is heavy, etc. No, it's anybody really. I have so many clients with a welder on site. That's the guy that's going to be wearing, you know, the welding helmet. He's going to be wearing the long sleeve. He's going to be wearing the apron, the metatarsal protection, whatever he is wearing. That's going to prevent him from effectively getting rid of excess heat. Guess what? If it hits 82 and he is a welder, boom, that's another trigger temperature. 82 and above in radiant heat area. That means if it's really hot and you'll have boilers or tanks and mixers and things that generate more heat to that area, that's also another place where this regulation would apply. And 87 degrees and above the heat index or regular temperature. So any area of your facility where the temperature may hit 87 and your employees are present and it's regular dry bulb temperature, 87, boom, the regulation applies. Or 87 degrees and the regular dry bulb temperature is 86, but combined with humidity, the heat index says 80, it feels like 87 or above, boom, the regulation applies. And I'm gonna go a little bit more into why these different trigger temperatures, when you take into account personal protective equipment and radiant heat areas, and 87, either heat index or regular temp, matter. And it matters because there's an extra requirement when these things are brought to the table. So right here, this slide that I have in front of me, if that's you, then you have to comply with subsection E of the regulation, which is what brings that requirement for engineering controls, administrative controls, and PPE. All right. So there's some exemptions. Yeah.
We have a question. If you could clarify what regular temperature is this 82 degrees Fahrenheit?
Regular temperature, I mean, the definition of temperature in the regulation is the ambient temperature with a dry bulb thermometer. That's what it means. So we go back to our definitions, and that's why I say whenever the regular temperature, when you're measuring, you have a regular dry bulb temperature thermometer in your facility that says is 82 degrees. That's what I mean, right? But heat index is when you take dry bulb temperature plus the humidity. And I have some devices that it would all make sense as we go right along, okay? So when I say regular temperature, it means dry bulb thermometer measured by any regular dry bulb thermometer when you shield it from radiant heat sources such as the sun. That's your regular temperature, okay? So we're not talking about radiant heat, and we're not talking about being exposed to the sun. We're talking just dry bulb temperature per the definition. Okay, exemptions. Let me go through the exemptions. Everything is going to start making sense, guys. Teleworking employees, of course, they're going to be exposed to heat, okay? But it doesn't apply to them because you don't have any way of really implementing controls for people that are going here and there or working from home or from other locations. There's an exemption for prisons, local detention facilities, and juvenile centers. So it's just what the regulation says. I guess they're really helping them save a lot of money. Number 3, incidental work. Okay, so this is the one where some sheds and storage rooms and areas that get really hot may not be covered under the regulation if the heat inside, but see, because it says incidental work that falls within 82 degrees to 95 degrees in that area. So you still have to have a thermometer in there. You realize this. So now you're buying tons of thermometers. That's basically it with this regulation. Because now you need to know, it's not that you're going to wing it. Yeah, it feels kind of hot in here, like we did before. Yeah, it's hot and we should not let people spend more than 20 minutes while retrieving things in this shed. We could do that before on their IIPP. Now we can't. We have to have a thermometer because if this little shed goes from beyond 95 degrees, then it's covered under the regulation because you're having employees access it. But if the heat in that shed goes from 82 to 95 degrees when employees access it, and they work in there for less than 15 minutes and during the span of 1 hour, then it won't apply to that space. So good luck with that. You really have to make sure that it's not more than 15 minutes within the span of an hour and that the temperature is not hotter than 82 to 95 degrees. Boom. So that's one of the exemptions. But it doesn't apply to vehicles with broken air conditioning. Please fix your vehicles. Those are work vehicles. They need to have AC or people are going to be really suffering heat illness, number one. Then number two, it doesn't apply to shipping containers. Why? Because you need to have thermometers. First of all, what's in there? You might need to have some temperature control already because of the types of products that you have in there, but also because workers are going in there in and out with either pallet jacks or forklifts, and you need to make sure that they are healthy. So doesn't apply to shipping containers. You have to know what's the temperature in those as well. Look at your definitions. Oh my goodness, I put important ones. Okay, so I guess I really wanted to say that this is very important. Definitions are super important. I'm big on definitions. And that's why when someone says, what's regular temperature? Well, let's look at our definition, right? So important definitions that you need to be very familiar as you go through putting your policy in place. Number one, clothing that restricts heat removal, right? So if it's there for the purpose of protecting them against splashes or something that your processes are requiring through your assessment, PPE assessment is a requirement too. You do your PPE assessment and say, oh, you know what? They need a chemical resistant apron. That's PPE that restricts heat removal. They're not going to be able to, the sweat is not going to evaporate the same, etc. Right? So that brings the issue of if he's wearing that apron and it's 82 degrees, boom, section E applies. See what I mean? Okay. Globe temperature. That is brought to your attention because of radiant heat areas. So for those of you with facilities that mainly do distribution warehousing, this will not be an issue. But for those of you with manufacturing, with certain welding operations, tanks, boilers, mixers, machines that produce more heat and workers need to be near these machines or radiant heat areas, that's important because you need to measure how hot is it. So a high heat or high radiant heat area is whenever your temperature, regular temperature dry bulb thermometer, and the temperature around those tanks, mixers, whatever the heat is coming from, whenever you measure it with a globe temperature because it has to have that black sphere, 6-inch black sphere thermometer, and there's a 5-degree difference, then that area is considered a high radiant heat area, and you have to implement administrative controls, engineering controls, etc. That's why these definitions are important. Temperature, regular temperature, and it tells you measured with a dry bulb thermometer, right? Heat index. NIOSH has an actual table that says this is the feels like temperature that combines the dry bulb temperature with the humidity in the air to tell us how will it feel on the human body. So the higher the humidity and the higher temperature, the hotter it will feel. So it'll take you to a higher number. That's why it says if it hits 87 degrees by regular temperature, or if it hits 87 degrees heat index, boom, the regulation applies and section E applies. Interesting here that I also highlighted is that the definition for heat wave, it's also included in this regulation, and it's the same as the one in the outdoor reg. And I found it interesting because they put it as, they use the 80-degree trigger for the heat wave. So they say, if the temperature is measured and is 10 degrees different from the average in the past previous 5 days. You take the average of the past 5 days, and it is that number, the average is 10 degrees difference and above 80 for the next date of work, you have to implement acclimatization procedures because that's what the regulation considers to be heat wave. And this is a definition that your supervisors most of the time do not know. Seriously, they're not familiar with that. It's more of a technical definition, but during your training, you have to tell them, give them some exercises so that they know it's an easy, just take the average and make sure that you're planning work. And if there's that 10-degree difference and over 90, boom, it's a heat wave. So that's another number that is also in there in this regulation. Okay, let's get into provision of water. Hold on a second, because I need to see how far along we are in time. And I forgot to put my phone. Okay, yes, we gotta get going. Provision of water, I said, make sure you have these coolers with suitably cool water near the workers because you must encourage them to drink. So I have a couple issues here to tell you that that's where you're missing the mark. Number one is make sure that the water is not getting hot because wherever you're placing it, the environment is hot. So the water is getting hot as well. So workers don't want to pour water from that water cooler. Number two, ensure that it's close by so that the workers feel encouraged to drink. That's what it means to encourage them to drink. And I don't know. No, I have another question here about acclimatization, whether the process of acclimatization is required or is it at the employee's discretion? It is required. In this regulation, if you have a heat wave, it is required. There's actually several times when this is required. Number one, when they are not used to working in heat and they come to work for you in your warehouse and it's 82 and above and they have PPE, or is 87 and more, or is 82, boom, because the regulation is applying. So it says for 14 days, you have to observe them and acclimatize them. And the thing that is left at the discretion of the employer is how you want to acclimatize them. There's many guidelines. I really encourage you to look into NIOSH, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, guidelines for acclimatizing workers. They'll give you an idea of what light work, moderate work, and heavier work means in regards to the temperature and how many hours of exposure to that kind of temperature. So provisions for rest, it's very similar to outdoor settings. The only difference is that here you are providing for cool down areas. So it's mostly an indoor break room, and that's basically what everyone is doing. So the break room becomes this cool down area, and during training, you tell them because it's 82 and above, you have access to water now that is clearly marked, that is near you guys. So before we told you about this, but now we're being very adamant about your consumption of water. So you do 1 quart per hour per worker. And we also are telling you guys that you can rest before you have symptoms when it's 82 and above. Do you see what I'm saying? 82 and above, you're here working at the warehouse, you have the right to preventative cool down rest. And when you are resting, I have to ask workers if they have symptoms. So the requirement is to monitor employees. Right there, I put it in bold letters. Must monitor employee. Do you have any symptoms? No, I came here just to cool off, drink a little bit of water. Awesome. Okay. It's different if they say, yeah, I feel headachy. I don't know. It must be because I didn't sleep enough. No, I don't care what symptoms they tell you. If it's a symptom and it's hot, you blame it on heat illness because you're not a doctor and you cannot be saying why they're feeling headachy, right? So if there are symptoms and it's hot, blame it on heat, right? Until if they have to go to the clinic and they tell you different, okay, that's a different story. But if they're under your supervision and they have symptoms, you do not order them back to work until those symptoms have abated. You have to apply adequate response and you have to encourage them to remain there until the symptoms are gone. All of this in bold letters is included in the regulation, guys. I know, I'm getting you to think. I'm like, okay, wait a minute. So that means time away from work, time away from doing the job, and the productivity is going to be low. Oh, this is a myth. Guys, remember the statistics speak for themselves. People are working when they are suffering heat stress. And because of that, they end up in your clinics and having days away from work. That's so much worse than if you let them cool off and go back refreshed, you will have a more productive workforce. This is the spirit of the regulation. So you really have to have this communication with employees and tell them the intent of this cool down, preventative cool down rest. So make sure these areas are immediately available to workers. So if your break rooms are far and they have to walk a mile to get there, then it's not really going to be immediately available, and you have to come up with better ideas. So if there's a wing of your warehouse or a wing of your facility where they're doing packing, and you have some doors that they can access, and you can set up a cool down area outdoors, that's fine. What if you have a nice shady area where you can feel the difference in heat because the building provides good shade, and since the morning and overnight, it just creates a nice cool down area between the hours of 9 to 11 or 9 to 10. You can use that as a cool down area, even if it's outdoors. But once again, you must have a thermometer. You must have a way of measuring the temperature in that cool down area, because you have to keep that cool down area below 82 degrees. Does that make sense? That's the requirement, because the trigger temperature is 82. That cool down area, either indoor or outdoor, has to be below 82 degrees. Has to be cooler than the inside if it's going to be an outdoor. You have to measure temperature. Okay, very cool. And keep posting your questions at the end. If we get to them, that'll be great. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and you can send me an email, and or you can send Liz the email and we can respond these questions. So provisions for rest, your designated cool down areas, immediately available to work. It's kind of like what's required. I discussed this. It can be outdoor, has to be. I discussed all of this. Okay, so the famous Section E of the regulation. So now I hope that I made it easy to understand for all of us that when it hits 82 degrees and your employees are working in that type of temperatures, the regulation applies. So now, when it's 82 degrees and above, and they're wearing PPE, such as your welders or people that have some sort of chemical apron or chemical clothing or heat-resistant clothing, okay, now the trigger for them is 82 and above, and you have to comply with Section E of the regulation. And then 87 and above, when I say again regular temperature, that means the thermometer, regular dry bulb thermometer says is 87 degrees. Boom, that triggers Section E of the regulation. Of course, employees must be present, okay? So regular temperature, or you have one of those devices that tells you that the regular temperature is 85, but there's 60% humidity, and that brings it to 87 heat index. Boom, Section E of the regulation is triggered. So let me see what else I wrote here for you guys. Oh, yes, it says here, temperature and heat, the requirements are of Section E. You gotta start recording whichever is greater, and determine all other environmental factors. So you gotta turn around and say, okay, so where do we have radiant heat sources? Oh, well, we have this mixing machine and we have this other, compressor, or what do we have around here that is generating more heat? Environmental factors around that same area. Both requirements are there. You have to take measurements initially when you expect to meet that threshold of 82 or 87, as explained right here. And again, take measurements whenever you expect to be 10 degrees higher from your initial measurement. So now you have to think, okay, so I know that today, right now, we started our day at 82, but by 1 p.m. or 2 p.m., we're going to be in the 90s or 97. So now you know that you are getting there to those 10-degree difference. You have to take measurements again. This is the requirement per Section E. And you have to have a document that includes the date, the time, and the specific location. Where is it that you took this measurement? You have to keep these measurements for 1 year. Now, so if you hit those triggers, the 82 and above, the bolded here in the beginning, you hit those two, you have to do this. Unless you decide, you know what, I don't want to have the headache of having to keep these records for a full year and take it initially, and then whenever 10 degrees difference, it's a little bit of detail requirements. I'd rather just assume that it's going to get that hot. Okay, so I'm going to get there. Key issues here: measuring the temperature. The regulation says use a regular thermometer and a hygrometer, or actually not the regulation. This is in the FAQ. So let me backtrack there. In the FAQs, and this is something that most of my clients are doing. And this is how I told you today, let's start simple. This is the simple way of doing it, okay? Just get your thermometers in the area. Make sure that you review manufacturer's guidelines so that you know where to place them and what area it will cover. So it'll measure temperature in which for which type of square footage, right? And then it'll tell you, place it in the middle of the room if you have this much area, or it'll, whatever it says, you follow, right? Now, there's also a way to get a device that measures the actual temperature and the humidity, both in the same instrument, right? Now, for those of you that already have a thermometer in all of those areas where it gets hot, all you have to install is a hygrometer, which measures humidity. And then you get temperature, dry bulb temperature, and humidity. And then you just place your charts right next to these devices, and you can tell how hot does it feel. So if your dry bulb temperature says that it's 80 degrees, but your hygrometer says that there is 55% humidity, you're at 81 degrees. Okay, so you're still not there. But how about later in the day is 82 degrees dry bulb temperature, and then the humidity is still 55 or 60%. Now it's gonna feel like 84 degrees on the human body, right? And it's in the yellow caution, right? So that's why this National Weather Service heat index is very, very helpful, because it combines the dry bulb thermometer with the humidity, and then it tells you how hot it really feels, right? And now we know if it's 82 degrees and above, you have to comply with all the requirements of the regulation. Whenever you have any areas that you know are going to be hotter than the rest of your warehouses or packing areas, it's shipping areas, etc., then you have to use a globe thermometer for radiant heat. And this is the issue that is causing a little bit of headaches for some of us, because we can't find a globe thermometer that meets the requirements of the definition of what a globe thermometer is, with a 6-inch copper sphere painted in black matte, all of those requirements. They're expensive, but it does say, the regulation does say, or equivalent. And I'm going to grab that or equivalent, and I'm going to go with it, because there are more devices. So there's a brand, Kestrel. And by the way, Kestrel is mentioned in the model program, such as when you do your policy, it will give you some examples on how to go about engineering controls, administrative controls, and it'll mention the Kestrel device as one of those in the Cal OSHA model program. So those come with a globe thermometer, and you should be looking into buying those. So it goes from not measuring radiant heat to those devices that also measure radiant heat, and they're a little bit more expensive. But if you already know that you have radiant heat because of machinery and equipment, and mind you, there are workers around those areas. If there are no workers around those areas, then just look into barriers, right, that prevent that heat from getting to your workers. But if there's workers, for example, in breweries, they have to be mixing near these vats and tanks, etc. That's radiant heat. And so you have to check that there's that 5-degree difference in temperature. You know, it's a high heat area. So now we get into engineering controls, administrative, and PPE. So even if you say, oh, and I'm going to get into some of these measuring things. So there's the simple $25, $40 measuring devices that give you the actual dry bulb temperature combined with the humidity. So they give you both numbers in one display, and you can just have your chart right next to you. And that works, but just remember that these are designed more for like a desk, smaller areas. So just check your manufacturer's instructions, because it'll tell you for how big of an area these instruments are meant to be used on. And then you have some others that are more industrial, and I have right there the link for this tech instrumentation. And like I said, some of these I've seen at your location, some others I haven't. So it just really, you have to do your homework as to what will be good for you. In this case, this one is mostly used in warehouses, and it's a wall thermometer and hygrometer. So with this, you get both the dry bulb temperature and the humidity, All you have to do is get your chart right next to it, or give your supervisor the chart. Could be like a laminated copy. And when he looks and sees those measurements, he can find out the heat index, which is the feels like temperature, right? It's always going to be hotter. And so he knows what, per the policy that you're putting in place, what administrative control, engineering are going to be there already, because now you're doing the work. But then he, the supervisor, knows, okay, now it's time to implement administrative because it got this hot. Let's get into what that means. Just give me a chance to get there. So the requirements for instruments, whatever instruments you get, are to calibrate them. And if you get one of those nice Kestrels, there's one that I think the Kestrel 5400, that's a very good instrument. It'll not only measure heat index, temperature and humidity, but it also give you wind speed and radiant heat. That's the Kestrel 5400, I think. But it needs to be calibrated often, and you make sure that you calibrate per the manufacturer's instructions. There's even videos, right? Must use the National Weather Service. And because the actual specifications of your instruments tell you that, you'll be able to check that, or just make a phone call to the person that is selling you the instrument. It has to use the National Weather Service heat index. That means that chart that I showed you before. And the next thing in regards to when you use instruments is that you have to obtain active involvement of employees or union reps while taking measurements and identifying environmental risk factors. This is important because maybe you want to have the union rep walk with you as you're taking measurements, and also he'll be able to point out some of the environmental risk factors, such as, right here, look at this big window at 12 o'clock, you're going to have sun coming in and hitting your welders. That's an environmental risk factor. Maybe you didn't think about it because you scheduled that walkthrough in the morning and didn't think of the sun, but the union rep did, or the employee said, you know what, when we're here, my team gets a lot of sun. Okay, great. So that's required. There's a picture right here of the Kestrel 3000. This one does not measure radiant heat, but it is the simple instrument that will allow you to get the temperature, heat index, because it combines it with humidity, relative humidity. Now, if you're not going to measure temperatures, and then I put there in bolts, although technically you still have to. So the regulation says, okay, 82 degrees and above, everybody has to have water, cool down break, blah, blah. Now, if it's going to be hotter than 87, heat index or regular temp, or if you have 82 and PPE that restricts heat removal, you have to comply with Section E. Oh, you don't want to take measurements? Okay, no problem. Don't take measurements. You don't have to keep them for a full year. Assume that you're going to hit those numbers. And if you're going to hit those assume that you're going to hit those numbers, then immediately let's go into talking about engineering controls, administrative controls, and PPE. That's perfectly fine, right? But technically, you still have to know how hot it is, right? So you do have to take measurements. So the only good thing about technically not taking measurements is that you don't have to keep them for a year and be as detailed as keeping tabs on when it's going to get 10 degrees hotter to take a second measurement during the day or during that shift. Does that make sense? And ask questions. We'll go through them in a moment. So you technically still have to take measurements just to know how hot it is indoors so that you can implement controls. And also because once you implement controls, your goal is to bring the temperature below 82 degrees, right? So, and that's the goal, because it does say as low as feasible, right? So if the trigger temperature is 82, that should be your goal. Nevertheless, when you have a high heat radiant area and you're using engineering controls, you're going to try and reduce the temperature to 87 or below. You use your engineering controls to reduce temperature to 82 or below if the people that you are concerned about in that area are wearing PPE that restricts heat removal, okay? Or they're working a high heat radiant area. So if you're not able to hit these thresholds, then you have to just document that you're reducing the temperature to the lowest feasible level, and you're also going to reduce it to the lowest feasible level because you want to reduce the risk of heat illness. And then you move on to administrative and PPE. Now, the word feasible is not defined in the regulation because it's very complex, and you can look it up in the FAQs. By the way, there have been There's a list of 3 webinars by OSHA. And the reason I think is many of you guys are attending this webinar is because OSHA will not go into, you know, a lot of explanation about instruments, etc., because they can't. They cannot talk about it, because then it seems like they're sponsoring them. They've gotten in trouble in the past for that. And so they're kind enough to put out a webinar where they will explain some of the ins and outs of the regulation. So I encourage you to take those webinars as well. The plus here with the UCLA and Southern Education Research Centers, you can ask questions that maybe I will give you more of a practical solution, like what I've been seeing out there in the field. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be 100% for you. You have to still do your homework. So, and also let us know what your experience is. So here is an example of one of those cooling vests. They are not cheap. This is another by Uline, an evaporative cooling vest. You have to soak it 5 minutes in cold water, and you get about 1 to 2 hours of heat relief. Cools by exposure to open air. So if you don't have those roll-up windows where there's exposure to air, these will not work, right? So you have to really do your homework. This is why I put this example, so that you know what will work for you, for your facility, and for the type of work that you're doing. So I can already peg a couple of my clients where they have welders, where there's roll-up doors, and that vest will work if it is able to be worn under their welding protective clothing. Right, so federal OSHA is also trying to come up with indoor and outdoor heat illness prevention standard. I've had some questions regarding whether or not this is going to change what OSHA has in place right now. And the answer is no, because we are an independent OSHA program. What that means is federal OSHA gave us permission to have our own safety and health program, and to go through the process of rulemaking and approving standards. That's why OSHA, just through the Office of Administrative Law, they enacted this new regulation. So they will have other proposed heat triggers, and they will have other recommendations and other ways of doing heat illness. So what's the catch here? And I put the link there because there's a ton of good information, and right now they're in the process of open to public comment. So if you have sites where your headquarters may be in California, but you have establishments under federal OSHA jurisdiction, you may want to start looking into this, because they will be under federal OSHA versus OSHA. And the trigger is 80 degrees for them, not 82, even for indoor. All right. So I'm going to go over some of these questions. I made sure I hit some of the key requirements. We're going to go over some of the FAQs and the radiant heat and stuff like that. We went through measuring indoor heat through the simplest way, right? You have to have your dry bulb thermometer, and you also have to have your humidity measured. With those two combined, you look at your chart for heat illness, boom, you know what it feels like, and for your policy, what does that mean? Create an effective and comprehensive supervisor training. For the supervisor training, I do want you to add that layer of definitions, heat wave, and acclimatization. Make sure you add those layers for the supervisor training, because your regular employee doesn't need to know that. They don't need to know what acclimatization is. They do need to know that when they're not used to heat, that's a personal risk factor. So discussing personal risk factors is an issue for employees. Okay. In the past, when we've done outdoor heat illness, I have given you my training guide for supervisors, which is different from employee training. And that's where I discuss examples of heat wave and training specific for supervisors. So you let me know if you need that. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of those questions, and the regulation says employer must provide cool down rest area for the number of employees during their breaks. We do not have sufficient air conditioned areas for 150 factory employees at one time. Right, so you do not have to have them all take these breaks at one time. What you want to say, well, first of all, we want to make sure that they don't take it all at the same time. And you already do this because you stagger your breaks. the breaks that they take by law. Every 2 hours, they have the right to a break, right? And then every 6 hours, they have the right to a 30-minute lunch break, right? So these are different. These are preventative cool down rests that you're telling them to take at any time. Okay, so that means before they even have symptoms, they do not have to wait for the regular break to take place. So you should be able to accommodate them because this is something that is going to happen at different times, not at the same time. That's one thing. And the second thing is it shouldn't be far away. So hopefully your air-conditioned break areas are close enough for them to take this cool down, preventative cool down breaks. That's why during training it's so important that you explain this to employees. And you see the lights go on. It's like, ooh, that means I can take breaks anytime I want to. Well, you have to remind them, this is when the temperature is hot, right? And I want to see you drinking water. And I'm also going to be asking you if you have symptoms. So expect all of that. They're being trained. And then you have to reassure them that the reason for this preventative cool down breaks is that you want them to be refreshed to keep working, right? Not that they spend their whole day in the break room, but rather that you want them refreshed so that the work can get done through these very hot days. What thermometer device do you recommend we use? Handheld or wall mounted? You can do both. So wall mounted applies really well for those areas where you already know it's very hot all the time. So warehouses, you should have a wall mounted thermometer. You should have mounted thermometers in any of those areas, for example, dry storage or, those sheds, warehousing, shipping areas. Any area that you know it's going to be hot, mount those thermometers. Follow instructions so that you know what area it's covered. So if it's meant for a 500 square footage area, that you maybe look for the middle of the room or which wall. The manufacturers will tell you because you don't want to put it in a wall, which is the one that's hit by the sun all day long. So the reading is going to be off. And you also want that, mind you, you may want that if you have workers by that wall. So all of this takes all this thinking. That's why this regulation is asking you to do your walkthroughs and determine environmental. This is the environmental risk factors that they're talking about. If you see that the wall where you're going to mount your thermometer is hit by the sun all the time, and you know that you have 10 employees constantly on computer stations right there by that wall, boom, that's the perfect place to place that thermometer, right? Because they're exposed to that kind of heat, and you want to know that temperature, right? Not the one in the middle of the room, because they're not in the middle of the room. They're by that wall where it gets hot, right? Very cool, very cool. And also when I said handheld, I do want you to do handheld because, you can get the supervisors one of those Kestrel 3000. That's not the very expensive one, especially if you do not have high heat radiant areas. They can just walk around with that device. And that one has less requirements for calibration versus the one that measures the radiant heat. So for those without the little black sphere on top, there's less maintenance in calibration, although all of your devices have some calibration and maintenance requirements. Please make sure you read this when you open the box and you're going through them. But yeah, the handheld is very good for your supervisors to have. The Kestrel ones are very friendly for putting them in your pocket, and if they fall, they won't break. They have a very easy display, just 3 buttons. So that's one of the ones in your model program that is recommended. So are the measurements to prove that you do not need engineering controls? Yes. So I love this. If you realize that you are under 82 degrees most of the time because you put a nice swamp cooler in this area and you put 2 more around there, and now you get your devices and hey, it's 81. We're keeping it at 81. We're keeping it at 81. Guess what? Boom, you don't have to implement engineering or administrative or any of that. Isn't that awesome? Yeah, it is. And then are swamp coolers allowed to cool down worker? Absolutely. So that I was just talking about that. Swamp coolers are some of the best ones because your big fans, all they do is just move hot air around versus your swamp coolers that actually will cool the air. Okay, so now I'm going to just go over that model program. So
We have a couple more questions. Some of them are in the chat. So one of them is, how are kitchens providing water to cooks? The health department does not allow for personal containers.
Oh, that's very, very good. So now you're going to play with those other requirements. A lot of you have other agencies requiring like food safety, etc. So for cooks, this is what you have to do. And this is what I would do. Cooks, chefs, sous chefs, big kitchens, they get so intense into the work they're doing. They're going to forget about drinking water. And then you're going to have fainted chefs. You don't want that because then it goes kaput, right? And I know you already have experience with this, but what if, because your operation, your hotel, your restaurant grew, whatever, now the kitchen is bigger, it gets hotter, whatever it is, I would recommend that you implement administrative controls such as alarms to drink water. I like that one because it's a principle used in agriculture. Because workers need to be reminded of drinking water, they will sound a horn. And I'm not saying that you sound a big horn in your kitchens, but what about an alarm? So supervisor sets an alarm, it rings, and then he says, okay, water. And they make sure people are drinking water, at least 1 quart per hour per worker. Everyone in that kitchen has to be drinking that much water. So very good question. So I would either send them to go out to the hall area where you have all of those water containers, set up an area where everybody has a nice shelf with their names and their water containers. So when that alarm sounds, they go out there and drink. Those are administrative controls. You have to come up with the answers. I love the questions because it gives us this chance to brainstorm, but that's the way to do it.
So we have another question. What is the definition or limit for high radiant heat? And how much heat does a device have to emit before it's considered high?
High radiant heat areas are a 5-degree difference between the regular temperature and whatever that area of high heat is. So it's that 5-degree difference. Has to be measured with a device that measures radiant heat. That's where the black sphere requirement comes into place, or equivalent. And I'm going to go with the or equivalent because it's been hard to find that 6-inch sphere globe thermometer to measure radiant heat. It's expensive, and I mean, I've spent time, serious time looking for it. And if any of you have found some devices that are not super expensive, because the one I found was like 1,000 plus, and it did have the 6-inch sphere, but then I got the rep to call me back and say, we do not have it in stock right now. Mind you, I was just very frustrated. But then I realized the regulation does say or equivalent. What that means, it gives you the freedom to look for a device that measures radiant heat. And so you put it next to your tanks, or mind you, the manufacturer's instructions will tell you how far from the radiant heat source, even if it's a window with sun coming through it, that's radiant heat. It'll tell you where to place the device, how far, and it'll give you a measurement. And if that measurement is 5 degrees hotter than the temperature in other areas without that radiant heat, that's considered under the regulation a high heat radiant area. And you must implement engineering and administrative and PPE. Did I answer the question? Please tell me if I went up on a tangent. I think I have another one. Water fountains required and not required. Water fountains are required or not required. Okay, so there's nothing in the reg that says water fountains are required. What's required is that you encourage them to drink water. Now you get to use your imagination, how you want to do that. Because you will get cited by OSHA if you place an igloo or a water fountain that is so far from the shipping department, so that the shipping department guys have to take 5-10 minutes to walk all the way to where your drinking fountain is. That wouldn't be encouraging. I wouldn't be encouraged to drink water. Encouraging is, for example, when I have a warehouse and I have Tourette truck drivers, and those are the forklifts that go really high up, okay? So some of these order pickers are way up there near the ceiling where it's way hotter, right? So what does it mean to encourage them to drink often and so that they get 1 quart per hour per worker? It means that I'm going to be randomly inspecting them to see that when that thing comes down and I see the worker, I say, hi, how are you? Can I see where your water is at? And by the way, Tourette trucks have an actual cup holder. They have to have their water right there. They're drinking. If they're up there in the ceiling, they're drinking. They're down here, they're drinking. They don't have to get off that Tourette truck and get their harness off and walk to the office to drink water, which, by the way, that's what was happening, but not anymore after this regulation came into being. Could we just consider staff that work in sheds or vehicle bays as outdoor employees and just follow the outdoor standard? Okay, this is going to be an interesting answer. So if the heat that you're concerned that they're exposed to is mostly the outdoor heat because that's where they spend most of the day, then yeah, they're an outdoor worker. But in this case, vehicle base, I have to do an assessment. How often, how much do they go in the warehouse? And is the warehouse air conditioned? Or maybe they are in the loading dock and the loading dock is cooled because of the type of products that you are loading and unloading require some sort of temperature control. And so it's cooler than the outside. And once again, you have to take measurements. If it is mostly 81 degrees and below in that area, because it's kept cool, although it's open, then you don't have to do indoor. It's just outdoor. Does that make sense? It really depends on your setting. So what I'm going to say to your question is sheds or vehicle bays, yes, outdoor heat. But if every time they go inside the loading docks, every time they go inside the shipping area, every time they go inside the offices, there's no air conditioning in those indoor areas, you have to measure that temperature in those indoor areas to know whether or not you have to have an indoor policy in place. Cool. I hope that answered it. Is this law going to affect, thank you. I love the feedback. Is this law going to affect California Retail Food Code? Right now, there is no specific temperature language. Cal OSHA has no jurisdiction over any other regulatory body. So they're not going to say, you know what, now let's talk to those guys and let's modify. No. This is, and we have to remember that 3396, which is the section under Title 8 California Code of Regulations, applies to employees, the human beings working for you. That's all they care about. They don't care about your food. They don't care about your restaurants. They don't care about anything that you produce. This regulation is made to protect the employee that works for you. So now you get to play with a combination of regs that you have out there. And this has happened throughout history with Cal OSHA. So they may give you regulations regarding chemical safety under the hazard communication, but then you have the Environmental Protection Agency. Or what if you are working with pesticides? You have another governmental body that regulates pesticides. So now you have 3 different regulations that you have to comply with. Same thing here. But this will not affect what you already have for food safety. It's only going to affect what do you do with those employees that work in areas where it is hot, even if it's indoors. Other food facilities shall have sufficient ventilation to facilitate proper food storage and to provide a reasonable condition of comfort for each employee, consistent with the job performed by the employee. Yeah, so the retail food code is keeping it very general. So now what this does is, and it's actually good that they keep it so general, kind of like you determine these conditions that are of comfort for each of your employees. Now, California OSHA got pickier and said 82 degrees and below, keep it less than 82 degrees. So 82 and above triggers the reg. If you keep it less than 82, you do not have to look into anything else. You're A-okay, but you have to tell me and prove to me that the temperatures indoors are below 82, right? So you have to take measurements. So now at the minimum, if you know that you keep your indoor areas cool enough, at the minimum, you have to have those thermometers to prove to Cal OSHA that you really do keep those areas less than 82 degrees. Gatorade in place or water, okay. Oh yes, Gatorade. So during my training, I talk about Gatorade. I like Gatorade. Gatorade is part of my response, my levels of response. So when I do training, I always share with everyone this Centers for Disease Control handout. Can everyone see this handout? I think we're seeing it in English. So this handout talks about acclimatization, environmental factors, medications, and it talks about hydration. Water is what's recommended, but once you have cramps, so if someone is experiencing symptoms, the response, and if you have the app in your phone that talks about how to respond to heat illness, one of the responses whenever someone is cramping up, suffering from cramps, your muscles start cramping up because they don't have enough water to function. The large muscles in the body are dehydrated. And so one of the best things to do for response is to give them some sort of electrolyte or Gatorade, one of those drinks that will help to replenish those salts and the electrolytes so that the cramping stops. Because if the cramping doesn't stop, then they have to go to the clinic, because that means they continue to be dehydrated and you do not want to send them back to work dehydrated. They got to go and most likely get fluids through an IV. All right, temp at the factory is in the same is the same as the outdoor temp. All other office indoor have AC. That's wonderful. So see, if your employee is working at factory and there's multiple bay doors open, you have to prove to me that the temperature inside the factory is the same as the outdoor temp. And I say that because if I go there and I do a walkthrough with you, I'm going to be measuring the difference in temperature inside and outside, because you will be surprised, but many times that radiant heat from the sun hitting your indoor areas through those roll-up doors or bay doors get hotter than the outdoors. Because outdoor you may have a breeze and indoors is just hot and stuffy. There's no movement of air. So as long as you can prove to me that it is the same temperature, I have no problem as long as it is under 82 degrees. Does that make sense? All right. I think it's 12 o'clock. For those of you, I didn't get to share with you the model program, but it is in the resources for Cal OSHA. And I highly encourage you to use that as the starting point of your policy. It's a great guide you by the hand. And if you have any questions, you let us know and we're here to help. Salt tablets still used out there. I think some people use salt tablets. I don't recommend them, especially because you don't know the liability issues with salt tablets. Same as a lot of you do give, what is the sweet treat that you put in the refrigerators? How do you call those, Liz? You know the long elongated packets of sugary fluids?
Water pops.
Yeah, that they like to suck on. I only know the name in Spanish, I'm sorry. Well, but some people put them in freezers and will allow workers to have access to them throughout their work when it's hot. I'm not very happy about those or salt tablets because of diabetes issues and high blood pressure. You don't know what you don't know. And if now on top of heat illness, you have to worry about making their conditions worse, not a good thing. So rather stay away from that. Plain water is the best and use Gatorade as the way to respond whenever they are already dehydrated. I am so glad for your comments. Thank you, guys. Don't forget to fill out the actual evaluation. Cool. We're seeing a lot of, yes, just popsicles. It's like Alba, it's just the popsicle. Okay, a lot of you guys have already integrated the indoor I love the model program because it integrates both outdoor and indoor, which is what we really needed. The outdoor heat illness model program by Cal OSHA was not as helpful. Of course, you get good at anything that you try out many times in life, but I always found that program a little bit more complicated than this policy that they came out with. So use that one. Oh, thank you. I'm glad you guys derived benefit from today. Awesome. Awesome.
Yes, and I wanted to add that we will be having a Spanish version of today's webinar on September 6th. So for our next safety updates webinar. We want to encourage you all to invite coworkers or anyone that is Spanish speaking to be able to have this information as well. We'll also be working on a couple of fact sheets to complement what is available from Cal OSHA, just because we know there's a lot of questions about what some of the requirements are and more definitions that we can go into a little bit more depth than Cal OSHA can. Only we'll send those via email when they're available too. If you have any questions, as always, please feel to email us at erc@ph.ucla.edu, and then I will connect. Either myself will respond or I'll connect you with Alba.
Thank you so much, Liz. I loved it. There's someone who joined from India. Isn't that awesome?
Oh, great. I'm sorry it's so late, but thank you.
Thank you, Liz, for your help. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you September. Spread the word. Get all of those people that speak Spanish to attend, and I'll see you then.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Liz.